Section 25 of Essays Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Daniel Fraser. Essays Book 1 by Michel de Montaigne. Translated by Charles Cotton. Chapter 25 on the Education of Children, Part 1. To Madame Diane de Foix, Comtesse de Gerson. I never yet saw that father, but let his son be never so decrepit or deformed, would not, notwithstanding, own him, not, nevertheless, if he were not totally besotted, and blinded with his paternal affection, that he did not well enough discern his defects, but that, with all defaults, he was still his. Just so, I see better than any other, that all I write here are but the idle reveries of a man that has only nibbled upon the outward crust of sciences in his nonage, and only retained a general and formless image of them, who has got a little snatch of everything and nothing of the whole, à la François. For I know, in general, that there is such a thing as physic, as jurisprudence, 4 parts in mathematics, and roughly what all these aim and point at. And, peradventure, I yet know farther, what sciences in general pretend unto, in order to the service of our life. But to dive farther than that, and to have cudgelled my brains in the study of Aristotle, the monarch of all modern learning, or particularly addicted myself to any one science, I have never done it. Neither is there any one art of which I am able to draw the first lineaments and dead colour. Insomuch that there is not a boy of the lowest form in a school that may not pretend to be wiser than I, who am not able to examine him in his first lesson, which, if I am at any time forced upon, I am necessitated, in my own defence, to ask him, unaptly enough, some universal questions, such as may serve to try his natural understanding, a lesson as strange and unknown to him as his is to me. I never seriously settled myself to the reading any book of solid learning but Plutarch and Seneca, and there, like the Danaides, I eternally fill, and it as constantly runs out. Something of which drops upon this paper, but little or nothing stays with me. History is my particular game as to matter of reading, or else poetry, for which I have particular kindness and esteem. For, as Cleanthes said, as the voice, forced through the narrow passage of a trumpet, comes out more forcible and shrill, so, methinks, a sentence pressed within the harmony of verse darts out more briskly upon the understanding, and strikes my ear and apprehension with a smarter and more pleasing effect. As to the natural parts I have, of which this is the essay, I find them to bow under the burden. My fancy and judgment do but grope in the dark, tripping and stumbling in the way, and when I have gone as far as I can, I am in no degree satisfied. I discover still a new and greater extent of land before me, with a troubled and imperfect sight, and wrapped up in clouds that I am not able to penetrate, and taking upon me to write indifferently of whatever comes into my head, and therein making use of nothing but my own proper and natural means, if it befall me, as ofttimes it does, accidentally to meet in any good author the same heads and commonplaces upon which I have attempted to write, as I did but just now in Plutarch's Discourse of the Force of Imagination, to see myself so weak and so forlorn, so heavy and so flat, in comparison of those better writers, I at once pity or despise myself. Yet do I please myself with this, that my opinions have often the honour and good fortune to jump with theirs, and that I go in the same path, though at a very great distance, and can say, ah, that is so. I am farther satisfied to find that I have a quality which everyone is not blessed withal, which is to discern the vast difference between them and me, and, notwithstanding all that, suffer my own inventions, low and feeble as they are, to run on in their career, without mending or plastering up the defects that this comparison has laid open to my own view. And, in plain truth, a man had need of a good strong back to keep pace with these people. The indiscreet scribblers of our times, who, amongst their laborious nothings, insert whole sections and pages out of ancient authors, with a design by that means to illustrate their own writings, do quite contrary. For this infinite dissimilitude of ornaments renders the complexion of their own compositions so sallow and deformed that they lose much more than they get. The philosophers Chrysippus and Epicurus were in this of two quite contrary humours. The first, not only in his books mixed passages and sayings of other authors, but entire pieces, and in one the whole Medea of Euripides, which gave Apollodorus occasion to say, that should a man pick out of his writings all that was none of his, he would leave him nothing but blank paper. Whereas the latter, quite on the contrary, in 300 volumes that he left behind him, has not so much as one quotation. Diogenes Laertius, Lives of Chrysippus, 7, 181, and Epicurus, 10, 26. I happened, the other day, upon this piece of fortune. I was reading a French book, whereafter I had a long time run dreaming over a great many words, so dull, so insipid, so void of all wit or common sense, that indeed they were only French words. After a long and tedious travel, I came at last to meet with a piece that was lofty, rich, and elevated to the very clouds, of which, had I found either the declivity easy or the ascent gradual, there had been some excuse, but it was so perpendicular a precipice, and so wholly cut off from the rest of the work, that by the first 6 words I found myself flying into the other world, and thence discovered the vale whence I came so deep and low, that I had never had since the heart to descend into it any more. If I should set out one of my discourses with such rich spoils as these, it would, but too evidently, manifest the imperfection of my own writing. To reprehend the fault in others that I am guilty of myself, appears to me no more unreasonable than to condemn, as I often do, those of others in myself. They are to be everywhere reproved, and ought to have no sanctuary allowed them. I know very well how audaciously I myself, at every turn, attempt to equal myself to my thefts, and to make my style go hand in hand with them, not without a temerarious hope of deceiving the eyes of my reader from discerning the difference. But withal, it is as much by the benefit of my application that I hope to do it, as by that of my invention or any force of my own. Besides, I do not offer to contend with the whole body of these champions, nor hand to hand with any one of them. It is only by flights and little light attempts that I engage them. I do not grapple with them, but try their strength only, and never engage so far as I make a show to do. If I could hold them in play, I were a brave fellow, for I never attack them but where they are most sinewy and strong. To cover a man's self, as I have seen some do, with another man's armour, so as not to discover so much as his fingers' ends, to carry on a design, as it is not hard for a man that has anything of a scholar in him, in an ordinary subject, to do, under old inventions patched up here and there with his own trumpery, and then to endeavour to conceal the theft, and to make it pass for his own, is first injustice and meanness of spirit in those who do it, who, having nothing in them of their own fit to procure them a reputation, endeavour to do it by attempting to impose things upon the world in their own name, which they have no manner of title to; and next, a ridiculous folly to content themselves with acquiring the ignorant approbation of the vulgar by such a pitiful cheat, at the price, at the same time, of degrading themselves in the eyes of men of understanding, who turn up their noses at all this borrowed incrustation, yet whose praise alone is worth the having. For my own part, there is nothing I would not sooner do than that neither have I said so much of others, but to get a better opportunity to explain myself. Nor in this do I glance at the composers of centos, who declare themselves for such, of which sort of writers I have in my time known many very ingenious, and particularly one under the name of Capilippus, besides the ancients. These are really men of wit, and that make it appear they are so, both by that and other ways of writing. As, for example, Lipsius, in that learned and laborious contexture of his Politics. But, be it how it will, and how inconsiderable soever these ineptitudes may be, I will say I never intended to conceal them, no more than my old, bald, grizzled likeness before them, where the painter has presented you not with a perfect face, but with mine. For these are my own particular opinions and fancies, and I deliver them as only what I myself believe, and not for what is to be believed by others. I have no other end in this writing, but only to discover myself, who also shall, peradventure, be another thing tomorrow, if I chance to meet any new instruction to change me. I have no authority to be believed, neither do I desire it, being too conscious of my own inerudition to be able to instruct others. Someone then, having seen the preceding chapter, the other day told me at my house that I should a little farther have extended my discourse on the education of children. Now, madam, if I had any sufficiency in this subject, I could not possibly better employ it than to present my best instructions to the little man that threatens you shortly with a happy birth, for you are too generous to begin otherwise than with a male. For, having had so great a hand in the treaty of your marriage, I have a certain particular right and interest in the greatness and prosperity of the issue that shall spring from it. Beside that, your having had the best of my services so long in possession, sufficiently obliges me to desire the honour and advantage of all wherein you shall be concerned. But, in truth, all I understand as to that particular is only this, that the greatest and most important difficulty of human science is the education of children. For, as in agriculture, the husbandry that is to precede planting, as also planting itself, is certain, plain, and well known. But after that which is planted comes to life, there is a great deal more to be done, more art to be used, more care to be taken, and much more difficulty to cultivate and bring it to perfection. So it is with men. It is no hard matter to get children, but after they are born, then begins the trouble, solicitude, and care rightly to train, principle, and bring them up. The symptoms of their inclinations in that tender age are so obscure, and the promises so uncertain and fallacious, that it is very hard to establish any solid judgment or conjecture upon them. Look at Cimon, for example, and Themistocles, and 1,000 others who very much deceived the expectation men had of them. Cubs of bears and puppies readily discover their natural inclination, but men, so soon as ever they are grown up, applying themselves to certain habits, engaging themselves in certain opinions, and conforming themselves to particular laws and customs, easily alter, or at least disguise, their true and real disposition, and yet it is hard to force the propension of nature. Whence it comes to pass, that for not having chosen the right course, we often take very great pains, and consume a good part of our time in training up children to things for which, by their natural constitution, they are totally unfit. In this difficulty, nevertheless, I am clearly of opinion that they ought to be elemented in the best and most advantageous studies, without taking too much notice of, or being too superstitious in those light prognostics they give of themselves in their tender years, and to which Plato in his Republic gives, methinks, too much authority. Madam, science is a very great ornament, and a thing of marvellous use, especially in persons raised to that degree of fortune in which you are, and, in truth, in persons of mean and low condition. It cannot perform its true and genuine office, being naturally more prompt, to assist in the conduct of war, in the government of peoples, in negotiating the leagues and friendships of princes and foreign nations, than in forming a syllogism in logic, in pleading a process in law, or in prescribing a dose of pills in physic. Wherefore, madam, believing you will not omit this so necessary feature in the education of your children, who yourself have tasted its sweetness, and are of a learned extraction, for we yet have the writings of the ancient Counts of Foix, from whom my lord, your husband, and yourself, are both of you descended, and Monsieur de Candale, your uncle, every day obliges the world with others, which will extend the knowledge of this quality in your family for so many succeeding ages. I will, upon this occasion, presume to acquaint your ladyship with one particular fancy of my own, contrary to the common method, which is all I am able to contribute to your service in this affair. The charge of the tutor you shall provide for your son, upon the choice of whom depends the whole success of his education, has several other great and considerable parts and duties required in so important a trust, besides that of which I am about to speak. These, however, I shall not mention, as, being unable to add anything of moment to the common rules, and in this, wherein I take upon me to advise, he may follow it so far only as it shall appear advisable. For a boy of quality, then, who pretends to letters not upon the account of profit, for so mean an object is unworthy of the grace and favour of the Muses, and, moreover, in it a man directs his service to and depends upon others, nor so much for outward ornament, as for his own proper and peculiar use, and to furnish and enrich himself within, having rather a desire to come out an accomplished cavalier than a mere scholar or learned man. For such a one, I say, I would also have his friends solicitous to find him out a tutor, who has rather a well-made than a well-filled head, seeking, indeed, both the one and the other, but rather of the two to prefer manners and judgment to mere learning, and that this man should exercise his charge after a new method. 'Tis the custom of pedagogues to be eternally thundering in their pupils' ears, as they were pouring into a funnel, whilst the business of the pupil is only to repeat what the others have said. Now I would have a tutor to correct this error, and that at the very first he should, according to the capacity he has to deal with, put it to the test, permitting his pupil himself to taste things, and of himself to discern and choose them, sometimes opening the way to him, and sometimes leaving him to open it for himself. That is, I would not have him alone to invent and speak, but that he should also hear his pupil speak in turn. Socrates and since him Arcesilaus made first their scholar speak, and then they spoke to them. Diogenes Laertius 4:36. Ob est plerumque iis, qui discere volunt, auctoritas eorum, qui docent. The authority of those who teach is very often an impediment to those who desire to learn. Cicero, De Natura Deor, I. 5. It is good to make him, like a young horse, trot before him, that he may judge of his going, and how much he is to abate of his own speed, to accommodate himself to the vigour and capacity of the other, for want of which due proportion we spoil all, which also to know how to adjust, and to keep within an exact and due measure, is one of the hardest things I know, and 'tis the effect of a high and well-tempered soul, to know how to condescend to such puerile motions, and to govern and direct them. I walk firmer and more secure uphill than down. Such as, according to our common way of teaching, undertake, with one and the same lesson, and the same measure of direction, to instruct several boys of differing and unequal capacities, are infinitely mistaken. And 'tis no wonder if in a whole multitude of scholars there are not found above 2 or 3 who bring away any good account of their time and discipline. Let the master not only examine him about the grammatical construction of the bare words of his lesson, but about the sense, and let him judge of the profit he has made, not by the testimony of his memory, but by that of his life. Let him make him put what he has learned into 100 several forms, and accommodate it to so many several subjects, to see if he yet rightly comprehends it, and has made it his own, taking instruction of his progress by the pedagogic institutions of Plato. 'Tis a sign of crudity and indigestion to disgorge what we eat in the same condition it was swallowed. The stomach has not performed its office unless it have altered the form and condition of what was committed to it to concoct. Our minds work only upon trust, when bound and compelled to follow the appetite of another's fancy, enslaved and captivated under the authority of another's instruction. We have been so subjected to the trammel that we have no free nor natural pace of our own. Our own vigour and liberty are extinct and gone. Nunquam tutelae suae fiunt. They are ever in wardship. Seneca, Ep. 33. I was privately carried at Pisa to see a very honest man, but so great an Aristotelian that his most usual thesis was that the touchstone and square of all solid imagination, and of all truth, was an absolute conformity to Aristotle's doctrine, and that all besides was nothing but inanity and chimera, for that he had seen all and said all. A position that, for having been a little too injuriously and broadly interpreted, brought him once, and long kept him, in great danger of the Inquisition of Rome. Let him make him examine and thoroughly sift everything he reads, and lodge nothing in his fancy upon simple authority and upon trust. Aristotle's principles will then be no more principles to him than those of Epicurus and the Stoics. Let this diversity of opinions be propounded to and laid before him. He will himself choose if he be able. If not, he will remain in doubt. Che non mente save, dubia magrata. I love to doubt as well as to know. Dante, Inferno, 1193. For, if he embrace the opinions of Xenophon and Plato by his own reason, they will no more be theirs, but become his own. Who follows another, follows nothing, finds nothing, nay, is inquisitive after nothing. Non sumus sub rege, sibi quisque se vindicet. We are under no king, let each vindicate himself. Seneca, Ep. 33. Let him at least know that he knows. It will be necessary that he imbibe their knowledge, not that he be corrupted with their precepts. And no matter if he forget where he had his learning, provided he know how to apply it to his own use. Truth and reason are common to everyone, and are no more his who spake them first, than his who speaks them after. 'Tis no more according to Plato than according to me, since both he and I equally see and understand them. Bees cull their several sweets from this flower and that blossom, here and there where they find them, but themselves afterwards make the honey, which is all and purely their own, and no more thyme and marjoram. So the several fragments he borrows from others, he will transform and shuffle together to compile a work that shall be absolutely his own. That is to say, his judgment. His instruction, labour, and study tend to nothing else but to form that. He is not obliged to discover whence he got the materials that have assisted him, but only to produce what he has himself done with them. Men that live upon pillage and borrowing expose their purchases and buildings to everyone's view, but do not proclaim how they came by the money. We do not see the fees and perquisites of a gentleman of the long robe, but we see the alliances wherewith he fortifies himself and his family, and the titles and honours he has obtained for him and his. No man divulges his revenue, or at least, which way it comes in, but everyone publishes his acquisitions. The advantages of our study are to become better and more wise. 'Tis, says Epicharmus, the understanding that sees and hears. 'Tis the understanding that improves everything, that orders everything, and that acts, rules, and reigns. all other faculties are blind and deaf, and without soul, and certainly we render it timorous and servile in not allowing it the liberty and privilege to do anything of itself. Who ever asked his pupil what he thought of grammar and rhetoric, or of such and such a sentence of Cicero? Our masters stick them full-feathered in our memories, and there establish them like oracles, of which the letters and syllables are of the substance of the thing. To know by rote is no knowledge, and signifies no more but only to retain what one has entrusted to our memory. That which a man rightly knows and understands, he is the free disposer of at his own full liberty, without any regard to the author from whence he had it, or fumbling over the leaves of his book. A mere bookish learning is a poor, paltry learning. It may serve for ornament, but there is yet no foundation for any superstructure to be built upon it, according to the opinion of Plato, who says that constancy, faith and sincerity are the true philosophy, and the other sciences that are directed to other ends, mere adulterate paint. I could wish that Paluel or Pompey, those two noted dancers of my time, could have taught us to cut capers by only seeing them do it, without stirring from our places, as these men pretend to inform the understanding without ever setting it to work, or that we could learn to ride, handle a pike, touch a lute, or sing without the trouble of practice, as these attempt to make us judge and speak well, without exercising us in judging or speaking. Now, in this initiation of our studies in their progress, whatsoever presents itself before us is book sufficient. A roguish trick of a page, a sottish mistake of a servant, a jest at the table, are so many new subjects. And for this reason, conversation with men is of very great use, and travel into foreign countries, not to bring back an account of only how many paces Santa Rotonda is in circuit, or of the richness of Signora Livia's petticoats, or, as some others, how much Nero's face, in a statue in such an old ruin, is longer and broader than that made for him on some medal, but to be able chiefly to give an account of the humours, manners, customs, and laws of those nations where he has been, and that we may whet and sharpen our wits by rubbing them against those of others. I would that a boy should be sent abroad very young, and first, so as to kill two birds with one stone, into those neighbouring nations whose language is most differing from our own, and to which, if it not be formed betimes, the tongue will grow too stiff to bend. And also, 'tis the general opinion of all, that a child should not be brought up in his mother's lap. Mothers are too tender, and their natural affection is apt to make the most discreet of them all so overfond, that they can neither find in their hearts to give them due correction for the faults they may commit, nor suffer them to be inured to hardships and hazards, as they ought to be. They will not endure to see them return all dust and sweat from their exercise, to drink cold drink when they are hot, nor see them mount an unruly horse, nor take a foil in hand against a rude fencer, or so much as to discharge a carbine. And yet there is no remedy. Whoever will breed a boy to be good for anything when he comes to be a man, must by no means spare him when young, and must very often transgress the rules of physic. Vitamque sub dio, et trepidus agat in rebus. Let him live in open air, and ever in movement about something. Horace, Od. 2, 3, 5. It is not enough to fortify his soul, you are also to make his sinews strong, for the soul will be oppressed if not assisted by the members, and would have too hard a task to discharge two offices alone. I know very well, to my cost, how much mine groans under the burden, from being accommodated with a body so tender and indisposed, as eternally leans and presses upon her, and often in my reading perceive that our masters, in their writings, make examples pass for magnanimity and fortitude of mind, which really are rather toughness of skin, and hardness of bones. For I have seen men, women, and children naturally born of so hard and insensible a constitution of body, that a sound cudgelling has been less to them than a flirt with a finger would have been to me, and that would neither cry out, wince, nor shrink for a good swinging beating. And when wrestlers counterfeit the philosophers in patience, 'tis rather strength of nerves than stoutness of heart. Now, to be inured to undergo labour is to be accustomed to endure pain. Labor callum obducit dolori. Labour hardens us against pain. Cicero, Tusc. Quaes, 2:15. A boy is to be broken into the toil and roughness of exercise, so as to be trained up to the pain and suffering of dislocations, colics, cauteries, and even imprisonment and the rack itself, for he may come, by misfortune, to be reduced to the worst of these, which, as this world goes, is sometimes inflicted on the good as well as the bad. As for proof, in our present civil war, whoever draws his sword against the laws threatens the honestest men with the whip and the halter. And, moreover, by living at home, the authority of this governor, which ought to be sovereign over the boy he has received into his charge, is often checked and hindered by the presence of parents, to which may also be added that the respect the whole family pay him as their master's son, and the knowledge he has of the estate and greatness he is heir to, are, in my opinion, no small inconveniences in these tender years. And yet, even in this conversing with men I spoke of but now, I have observed this vice, that instead of gathering observations from others, we make it our whole business to lay ourselves open to them, and are more concerned how to expose and set out our own commodities than how to increase our stock by acquiring new. Silence, therefore, and modesty are very advantageous qualities in conversation. One should, therefore, train up this boy to be sparing and a husband of his knowledge when he has acquired it, and to forbear taking exceptions at, or reproving, every idle saying or ridiculous story that is said or told in his presence. For it is very unbecoming rudeness to carp at everything that is not agreeable to our own palate. Let him be satisfied with correcting himself, and not seem to condemn everything in another he would not do himself, nor dispute it as against common customs. Licet sapere sine pompa, sine invidia. Let us be wise without ostentation, without envy. Seneca, Ep. 103. Let him avoid these vain and uncivil images of authority, this childish ambition of coveting to appear better bred and more accomplished than he really will by such carriage discover himself to be, and as, if opportunities of interrupting and reprehending were not to be omitted, to desire thence to derive the reputation of something more than ordinary. For as it becomes none but great poets to make use of the poetical licence, so it is intolerable for any but men of great and illustrious souls to assume privilege above the authority of custom. Siquid Socrates and Aristippus contra morem et consuetudinem fecerunt, idem sibi ne arbitrita licere. Magnis enim illi et divinis bonis hanc licentium assequibanta. If Socrates and Aristippus have committed any act against manners and custom, let him not think that he is allowed to do the same, for it was by great and divine benefits that they obtained this privilege. Cicero, De Offic. 1:41. Let him be instructed not to engage in discourse or dispute, but with a champion worthy of him, and even there not to make use of all the little subtleties that may seem pat for his purpose, but only such arguments as may best serve him. Let him be taught to be curious in the election and choice of his reasons, to abominate impertinence, and consequently to affect brevity. But above all, let him be lessoned to acquiesce and submit to truth so soon as ever he shall discover it, whether in his opponent's argument, or upon better consideration of his own. For he shall never be preferred to the chair for a mere clatter of words and syllogisms, and is no further engaged to any argument whatever than as he shall in his own judgment approve it. Nor yet is arguing a trade, where the liberty of recantation and getting off upon better thoughts are to be sold for ready money. Neque ut omnia quox praescripta et imperata sint, defendat necessitate ulla cogita. Neither is there any necessity upon him that he should defend all things that are prescribed and enjoined him. Cicero, Acad. 2:3. If his governor be of my humour, he will form his will to be a very good and loyal subject to his prince, very affectionate to his person, and very stout in his quarrel. But withal he will cool in him the desire of having any other tie to his service than public duty, besides several other inconveniences that are inconsistent with the liberty every honest man ought to have. A man's judgment, being bribed and prepossessed by these particular obligations, is either blinded and less free to exercise its function, or is blemished with ingratitude and indiscretion. A man that is purely a courtier can neither have power nor will to speak or think otherwise than favourably and well of a master, who, amongst so many millions of other subjects, has picked out him with his own hand to nourish and advance. This favour, and the profit flowing from it, must needs, and not without some show of reason, corrupt his freedom and dazzle him. And we commonly see these people speak in another kind of phrase than is ordinarily spoken by others of the same nation, though what they say in that courtly language is not much to be believed. Let his conscience and virtue be eminently manifest in his speaking, and have only reason for their guide. Make him understand that to acknowledge the error he shall discover in his own argument, though only found out by himself, is an effect of judgment and sincerity, which are the principal things he is to seek after. That obstinacy and contention are common qualities, most appearing in mean souls, that to revise and correct himself, to forsake an unjust argument in the height and heat of dispute, are rare, great, and philosophical qualities. Let him be advised, being in company, to have his eye and ear in every corner, for I find that the places of greatest honour are commonly seized upon by men that have least in them, and that the greatest fortunes are seldom accompanied with the ablest parts. I have been present when, whilst they at the upper end of the chamber have been only commenting the beauty of the arras or the flavour of the wine, many things that have been very finely said at the lower end of the table have been lost and thrown away. Let him examine every man's talent, a peasant, a bricklayer, a passenger. One may learn something from every one of these in their several capacities, and something will be picked out of their discourse whereof some use may be made at one time or another. Nay, even the folly and impertinence of others will contribute to his instruction. By observing the graces and manners of all he sees, he will create to himself an emulation of the good, and a contempt of the bad. Let an honest curiosity be suggested to his fancy of being inquisitive after everything. Whatever there is singular and rare near the place where he is, let him go and see it. A fine house, a noble fountain, an eminent man, the place where a battle has been anciently fought, the passages of Caesar and Charlemagne. Quux tellus sit lenta gelu, quae putris ab aestu, ventus in Italium quis bene vela ferat. What country is bound in frost? What land is friable with heat? What wind serves fairest for Italy? Propertius 4:3-39. Let him inquire into the manners, revenues, and alliances of princes, things in themselves very pleasant to learn, and very useful to know. In this conversing with men, I mean also and principally those who only live in the records of history, he shall, by reading those books, converse with the great and heroic souls of the best ages. 'Tis an idle and vain study to those who make it so by doing it after a negligent manner, but to those who do it with care and observation, 'tis a study of inestimable fruit and value, and the only study, as Plato reports, that the Lacedaemonians reserve to themselves. What profit shall he not reap, as to the business of men, by reading the lives of Plutarch? But, withal, let my governor remember to what end his instructions are principally directed, and that he do not so much imprint in his pupil's memory the date of the ruin of Carthage, as the manners of Hannibal and Scipio, nor so much where Marcellus died, as why it was unworthy of his duty that he died there. Let him not teach him so much the narrative parts of history as to judge them. The reading of them, in my opinion, is a thing that of all others we apply ourselves unto with the most differing measure. I have read 100 things in Livy that another has not, or not taken notice of at least, and Plutarch has read 100 more there than ever I could find, or than, peradventure, that author ever wrote. To some it is merely a grammar study, to others the very anatomy of philosophy, by which the most abstruse parts of our human nature penetrate. There are in Plutarch many long discourses very worthy to be carefully read and observed, for he is, in my opinion, of all others the greatest master in that kind of writing. But there are 1,000 others which he has only touched and glanced upon, where he only points with his finger to direct us which way we may go if we will, and contents himself sometimes with giving only one brisk hit in the nicest article of the question, whence we are to grope out the rest. As for example where he says that the inhabitants of Asia came to be vassals to one only, for not having been able to pronounce one syllable, which is no; which saying of his gave perhaps matter and occasion to Laboti to write his voluntary servitude. Only to see him pick out a light action in a man's life, or a mere word that does not seem to amount even to that, is itself a whole discourse. 'Tis to our prejudice that men of understanding should so immoderately affect brevity. No doubt their reputation is the better by it, but in the meantime we are the worse. Plutarch had rather we should applaud his judgment than commend his knowledge, and had rather leave us with an appetite to read more than glutted with that we have already read. He knew very well that a man may say too much even upon the best subjects, and that Alexandridas justly reproached him who made very good but too long speeches to the Ephori, when he said, O stranger, thou speakest the things thou shouldst speak, but not as thou shouldst speak them. Plutarch, Apothegms of the Lacedaemonians. Such as have lean and spare bodies stuff themselves out with clothes. So they who are defective in matter endeavour to make amends with words. Human understanding is marvellously enlightened by daily conversation with men, for we are otherwise compressed and heaped up in ourselves, and have our sight limited to the length of our own noses. One asking Socrates of what country he was, he did not make answer of Athens, but of the world. Cicero, Tusc Quaes, 537, Plutarch on Exile, c. 4. He whose imagination was fuller and wider embraced the whole world for his country, and extended his society and friendship to all mankind. Not as we do, who look no further than our feet. When the vines of my village are nipped with the frost, my parish priest presently concludes that the indignation of God has gone out against all the human race, and that the cannibals have already got the pip. Who is it that, seeing the havoc of these civil wars of ours, does not cry out that the machine of the world is near dissolution, and that the day of judgment is at hand, without considering that many worse things have been seen, and that in the meantime people are very merry in 1,000 other parts of the earth for all this? For my part, considering the licence and impunity that always attend such commotions, I wonder they are so moderate, and that there is no more mischief done. To him who feels the hailstones patter about his ears, the whole hemisphere appears to be in storm and tempest. like the ridiculous Savoyard, who said very gravely that if that simple King of France could have managed his fortune as he should have done, he might in time have come to have been steward of the household to the Duke his master. The fellow could not, in his shallow imagination, conceive that there could be anything greater than a Duke of Savoy. And, in truth, we are all of us, insensibly, in this error. An error of a very great weight, and very pernicious consequence. But whoever shall represent to his fancy, as in a picture, that great image of our mother nature, in her full majesty and lustre, whoever in her face shall read so general and so constant a variety, whoever shall observe himself in that figure, and not himself, but a whole kingdom, no bigger than the least touch or prick of a pencil in comparison of the whole, that man alone is able to value things according to their true estimate and grandeur. This great world, which some do yet multiply as several species under one genus, is the mirror wherein we are to behold ourselves, to be able to know ourselves as we ought to do in the true bias. In short, I would have this to be the book my young gentleman should study with the most attention. So many humours, so many sects, so many judgments, opinions, laws, and customs, teach us to judge aright of our own, and inform our understanding to discover its imperfection and natural infirmity, which is no trivial speculation. So many mutations of states and kingdoms, and so many turns and revolutions of public fortune, will make us wise enough to make no great wonder of our own. So many great names, so many famous victories and conquests, drowned and swallowed in oblivion, render our hopes ridiculous of eternizing our names by the taking of half a score of light horse or a hen roost, which only derives its memory from its ruin. The pride and arrogance of so many foreign pomps, the inflated majesty of so many courts and grandeurs, accustom and fortify our sight without closing our eyes to behold the lustre of our own. So many trillions of men buried before us encourage us not to fear to go seek such good company in the other world. And so of the rest, Pythagoras was wont to say, Cicero, Tusc Quaes v. 3, that our life resembles the great and populous assembly of the Olympic Games, wherein some exercise the body, that they may carry away the glory of the prize. Others bring merchandise to sell for profit. There are also some, and those none of the worst sort, who pursue no other advantage than only to look on, and consider how and why everything is done, and to be spectators of the lives of other men, thereby the better to judge of and regulate their own. To examples may fitly be applied all the profitable discourses of philosophy, to which all human actions, as to their best rule, ought to be especially directed. A scholar shall be taught to know, quid facoptere, quid asper utile numus habet, patrix carisque propinquis quantum elagari deciat, quern te deus esse iusit, et humana qua parte locatus es in re, quid sumus et quidnam victori gignima. Learn what it is right to wish, what is the true use of coined money, how much it becomes us to give in liberality to our country and our dear relations, whom and what the deity commanded thee to be, and in what part of the human system thou art placed, what we are and to what purpose engendered. Persius 3:69. What it is to know, and what to be ignorant, what ought to be the end and design of study, what valour, temperance, and justice are, the difference betwixt ambition and avarice, servitude and subjection, licence and liberty, by what token a man may know true and solid contentment, how far death, affliction, and disgrace are to be apprehended, et quoquenque modo fugiatque, feratque laborum, and how you may shun or sustain every hardship. Virgil, Aeneid 3:459. By what secret springs we move, and the reason of our various agitations and irresolutions. For, methinks, the first doctrine with which one should season his understanding ought to be that which regulates his manners and his sense, that teaches him how to know himself, and how both well to dig and well to live. Amongst the liberal sciences, let us begin with that which makes us free, not that they do not all serve in some measure to the instruction and use of life, as all other things in some sort also do, but let us make choice of that which directly and professedly serves to that end. If we are once able to restrain the offices of human life within their just and natural limits, we shall find that most of the sciences in use are of no great use to us, and even in those that are, that there are many very unnecessary cavities and dilatations which we had better let alone, and, following Socrates' direction, limit the course of our studies to those things only where there is a true and real utility. Supere aude, incipe, qui recte vivendi prorogatorem, rusticus expectat, dum defluat amnis, at ille labitor et labetor in omne volubilis ovum. Dare to be wise, begin. He who defers the hour of living well is like the clown, waiting till the river shall have flowed out. But the river still flows, and will run on, with constant course, to ages without end. Horace, Ep. 1-2. 'Tis a great foolery to teach our children, quid moviant pisces, animosaque signa leonis, lotus et Hesperia, quid Capricornus aqua. What influence Pisces have, or the sign of angry Leo, or Capricorn, washed by the Hesperian wave. Propertius 4, I. 89. The knowledge of the stars and the motion of the eighth sphere before their own. What care I about the Pleiades or the stars of Taurus? Anacreon Ode, 1710. Anaximenes, writing to Pythagoras, to what purpose, said he, should I trouble myself in searching out the secret of the stars, having death or slavery continually before my eyes? For the king of Persia were at that time preparing to invade his country. Everyone ought to say thus: being assaulted as I am by ambition, avarice, temerity, superstition, and having within so many other enemies of life, shall I go ponder over the world's changes? End of section 25. Recording by Daniel Fraser.
Section 26 of Essays, Book 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Essays, Book 1, by Michel de Montaigne. Translated by Charles Cotton. Of the Education of Children, Part 2. After having taught him what will make him more wise and good, you may then entertain him with the elements of logic, physics, geometry, rhetoric, and the science which he shall then himself most incline to, his judgment being beforehand formed and fit to choose, he will quickly make his own. The way of instructing him ought to be sometimes by discourse, and sometimes by reading. Sometimes his governor shall put the author himself, which he shall think most proper for him, into his hands, and sometimes only the marrow and substance of it. And if himself be not conversant enough in books to turn to all the fine discourses the books contain for his purpose, there may some man of learning be joined to him, that upon every occasion shall supply him with what he stands in need of, to furnish it to his pupil. And who can doubt but that this way of teaching is much more easy and natural than that of Gaza, Theodore Gaza, rector of the Academy of Ferrara, in which the precepts are so intricate and so harsh, and the words so vain, lean, and insignificant, that there is no hold to be taken of them, nothing that quickens and elevates the wit and fancy, whereas here the mind has what to feed upon and to digest. This fruit, therefore, is not only without comparison, much more fair and beautiful, but will also be much more early ripe. 'Tis a thousand pities that matters should be at such a pass in this age of ours, that philosophy, even with men of understanding, should be looked upon as a vain and fantastic name, a thing of no use, no value, either in opinion or effect, of which I think those ergotisms and petty sophistries, by prepossessing the avenues to it, are the cause. And people are much to blame to represent it to children for a thing of so difficult access, and with such a frowning, grim, and formidable aspect. Who is it that has disguised it thus, with its false, pale, and ghostly countenance? There is nothing more airy, more gay, more frolic, and I had like to have said, more wanton. She preaches nothing but feasting and jollity. A melancholic anxious look shows that she does not inhabit there. Demetrius the grammarian, finding in the temple of Delphos a knot of philosophers set chatting together, said to them, Plutarch, Treatise on Oracles, which have ceased, either I am much deceived, or by your cheerful and pleasant countenances you are engaged in no very deep discourse. To which one of them, Heracleon the Megarian, replied, 'Tis for such as are puzzled about inquiring whether the future tense of the verb blank is spelt with a double A, or that hunt after the derivation of the comparatives blank and blank, and the superlatives blank and blank, to knit their brows whilst discoursing of their science. But as to philosophical discourses, they always divert and cheer up those that entertain them, and never deject them or make them sad. Deprendas animi tormenta latentis, in agro corpore, deprendas in gaudia, sumit atrumque inde habitum facies. You may discern the torments of mind lurking in a sick body, may discern its joys. Either expression the face assumes from the mind. Juvenal 9:18. The soul that lodges philosophy ought to be of such a constitution of health as to render the body in like manner healthful too. She ought to make her tranquillity and satisfaction shine so as to appear without, and her contentment ought to fashion the outward behaviour of her own mould, and consequently to fortify it with a graceful confidence, an active and joyous carriage, and a serene and contented countenance. The most manifest sign of wisdom is a continual cheerfulness. Her state is like that of things in the regions above the moon, always clear and serene. 'Tis Barocco and Baralipton, two terms of the ancient scholastic logic, that render their disciples so dirty and ill-favoured, and not she. They do not so much as know her but by hearsay. What! It is she that calms and appeases the storms and tempests of the soul, and who teaches famine and fevers to laugh and sing, and that, not by certain imaginary epicycles, but by natural and manifest reasons. She has virtue for her end, which is not, as the schoolmen say, situate upon the summit of a perpendicular, rugged, inaccessible precipice. Such as have approached her find her, quite on the contrary, to be seated in a fair, fruitful, and flourishing plain, whence she early discovers all things below. To which place any one may, however, arrive, if he know but the way, through shady, green, and sweetly flourishing avenues, by a pleasant, easy, and smooth descent, like that of the celestial vault. 'Tis for not having frequented this supreme, this beautiful, triumphant, and amiable, this equally delicious and courageous virtue, this so professed and implacable enemy to anxiety, sorrow, fear, and constraint, who, having nature for her guide, has fortune and pleasure for her companions, that they have gone, according to their own weak imagination, and created this ridiculous, this sorrowful, querulous, despiteful, threatening, terrible image of it to themselves and others, and placed it upon a rock apart, amongst thorns and brambles, and made of it a hobgoblin to affright people. But the governor that I would have, that is such a one as knows it to be his duty to possess his pupil with as much or more affection than reverence to virtue, will be able to inform him that the poets have evermore accommodated themselves to the public humour, and make him sensible that the gods have planted more toil and sweat in the avenues of the cabinets of Venus than in those of Minerva. and when he shall once find him begin to apprehend, and shall represent to him a Bradamante or an Angelica (heroines of Ariosto) for a mistress, a natural, active, generous, and not a viragoish, but a manly beauty, in comparison of a soft, delicate, artificial simpering and affected form, the one in the habit of a heroic youth, wearing a glittering helmet, the other tricked up in curls and ribbons like a wanton minx. He will then look upon his own affection as brave and masculine, when he shall choose quite contrary to that effeminate shepherd of Phrygia. Such a tutor will make a pupil digest this new lesson, that the height and value of true virtue consists in the facility, utility, and pleasure of its exercise; so far from difficulty, that boys, as well as men, and the innocent as well as the subtle, may make it their own. It is by order, and not by force, that it is to be acquired. Socrates, her first minion, is so averse to all manner of violence, as totally to throw it aside, to slip into the more natural facility of her own progress. 'Tis the nursing mother of all human pleasures, who in rendering them just, renders them also pure and permanent; in moderating them, keeps them in breath and appetite; in interdicting those which she herself refuses, whets our desire to those that she allows; and, like a kind and liberal mother, abundantly allows all that nature requires, even to satiety, if not to lassitude; unless we mean to say that the regimen which stops the toper before he has drunk himself drunk, the glutton before he has eaten to a surfeit, and the lecher before he has got the pox, is an enemy to pleasure. If the ordinary fortune fail, she does without it, and forms another, wholly her own, not so fickle and unsteady as the other. She can be rich, be potent and wise, and knows how to lie upon soft perfumed beds. She loves life, beauty, glory, and health; but her proper and peculiar office is to know how to regulate the use of all these good things, and how to lose them without concern; an office much more noble than troublesome, and without which the whole course of life is unnatural, turbulent, and deformed, and there it is indeed that men may justly represent these monsters upon rocks and precipices. If this pupil shall happen to be of so contrary a disposition that he had rather hear a tale of a tub than a true narrative of some noble expedition, or some wise and learned discourse, who at the beat of drum, that excites the youthful ardour of his companions, leaves that to follow another that calls to a Morris or the Bears, who would not wish, and find it more delightful and more excellent, to return all dust and sweat victorious from a battle, than from tennis or from a ball, with the prize of those exercises, I see no other remedy than that he be bound prentice in some good town to learn to make minced pies, though he were the son of a duke; according to Plato's precept, that children are to be placed out and disposed of, not according to the wealth, qualities, or condition of the father, but according to the faculties and the capacity of their own souls. Since philosophy is that which instructs us to live, and that infancy has there its lessons as well as other ages, why is it not communicated to children betimes? Udum et molle lutum est, nunc properandus, et acri figendus sine fine rota. The clay is moist and soft; now make haste, and form the pitcher on the rapid wheel. Persius 3:23. They begin to teach us to live when we have almost done living. 100 students have got the pox before they have come to read Aristotle's lecture on temperance. Cicero said that though he should live 2 men's ages, he should never find leisure to study the lyric poets; and I find these sophisters yet more deplorably unprofitable. The boy we would breed has a great deal less time to spare; he owes but the first 15 or 16 years of his life to education, the remainder is due to action. Let us, therefore, employ that short time in necessary instruction. Away with the thorny subtleties of dialectics; they are abuses, things by which our lives can never be amended. Take the plain philosophical discourses, learn how rightly to choose, and then rightly to apply them; They are more easy to be understood than one of Boccaccio's novels. A child from nurse is much more capable of them than of learning to read or to write. Philosophy has discourses proper for childhood, as well as for the decrepit age of men. I am of Plutarch's mind, that Aristotle did not so much trouble his great disciple with the knack of forming syllogisms, or with the elements of geometry, as with infusing into him good precepts concerning valour, prowess, magnanimity, temperance, and the contempt of fear, and with this ammunition sent him, whilst yet a boy, with no more than 30,000 foot, 4,000 horse, and but 42,000 crowns, to subjugate the empire of the whole earth. For the other acts and sciences, he says, Alexander highly indeed commended their excellence and charm, and had them in very great honour and esteem, but not ravished with them to that degree as to be tempted to affect the practice of them in his own person. Petit hinc, juvenesque senesque, finem amo certum, miserisque viatica canis. Young men and old men derive hence a certain end to the mind, and stores for miserable grey hairs. Persius 5:64. Epicurus, in the beginning of his letter to Menesius, Diogenes Laertius, 10:122, says, that neither the youngest should refuse to philosophize, nor the oldest grow weary of it. Who does otherwise seems tacitly to imply that either the time of living happily is not yet come, or that it has already passed. And yet, for all that, I would not have this pupil of ours imprisoned and made a slave to his book, nor would I have him given up to the morosity and melancholic humour of a sour ill-natured pedant. I would not have his spirit cowed and subdued by applying him to the rack and tormenting him, as some do, 14 or 15 hours a day, and so make a pack-horse of him. Neither should I think it good, when by reason of a solitary and melancholic complexion he is discovered to be overmuch addicted to his book, to nourish that humour in him, for that renders him unfit for civil conversation, and diverts him from better employments. And how many have I seen in my time totally brutified by an immoderate thirst after knowledge? Carneades was so besotted with it, that he would not find time so much as to comb his head or to pare his nails. Neither would I have his generous manners spoiled and corrupted by the incivility and barbarism of those of another. The French wisdom was anciently turned into proverb, early, but of no continuance. And in truth we yet see that nothing can be more ingenious and pleasing than the children of France, but they ordinarily deceive the hope and expectation that have been conceived of them, and grown up to be men have nothing extraordinary or worth taking notice of. I have heard men of good understanding say, these colleges of ours to which we send our young people, and of which we have but too many, make them such animals as they are. Hobbes said that if he had been at college as long as other people, he should have been as great a blockhead as they. W.C.H. And Bacon, before Hobbes' time, had discussed the futility of university teaching. D.W. But to our little monster, a closet, a garden, the table, his bed, solitude and company, morning and evening, all hours shall be the same, and all places to him a study. For philosophy, who, as the formatrix of judgment and manners, shall be his principal lesson, has that privilege to have a hand in everything. The orator Isocrates, having at a feast entreated to speak of his art, all the company were satisfied with and commended his answer. It is not now a time, said he, to do what I can do, and that which is now time to do I cannot do. Plutarch, Symposiacs 1:1. For to make orations and rhetorical disputes in a company met together to laugh and make good cheer had been very unreasonable and improper, and as much might have been said of all the other sciences. But as to what concerns philosophy, that part of it at least that treats of man, and of his offices and duties, it has been the common opinion of all wise men, that, out of respect to the sweetness of her conversation, she is ever to be admitted in all sports and entertainments. and Plato, having invited her to his feast, we see after how gentle and obliging a manner, accommodated both to time and place, she entertained the company, though in a discourse of the highest and most important nature. Ecce pauperibus prodest, locu pletibus ecce, et neglecta aeque pueris senibusque nocebit. It profits poor and rich alike, but, neglected, equally hurts old and young. Horace, Epistles, 1:25. By this method of instruction, my young pupil will be much more and better employed than his fellows of the college are. But as the steps we take in walking to and fro in a gallery, though 3 times as many, do not tire a man so much as those we employ in a formal journey, so our lesson, as it were accidentally occurring, without any set of obligation of time or place, and falling naturally into every action, will insensibly insinuate itself. By which means our very exercises and recreations, running, wrestling, music, dancing, hunting, riding, and fencing, will prove to be a good part of our study. I would have his outward fashion and mien, and the disposition of his limbs, formed at the same time with his mind. 'Tis not a soul, 'tis not a body that we are training up, but a man, and we ought not to divide him. And, as Plato says, we are not to fashion one without the other, but make them draw together like 2 horses harnessed to a coach. By which saying of his, does he not seem to allow more time for, and to take more care of exercises for the body, and to hold that the mind, in a good proportion, does her business at the same time too? As to the rest, this method of education ought to be carried on with a severe sweetness, quite contrary to the practice of our pedants, who, instead of tempting and alluring children to letters by apt and gentle ways, do in truth present nothing before them but rods and ferules, horror and cruelty. Away with this violence! Away with this compulsion, than which I certainly believe nothing more dulls and degenerates a well-descended nature. If you would have him apprehend shame and chastisement, do not harden him to them. Inure him to heat and cold, to wind and sun, and to dangers that he ought to despise. Wean him from all effeminacy and delicacy in clothes and lodging, eating and drinking. Accustom him to everything, that he may not be a Sir Paris, a carpet knight, but a sinewy, hardy, and vigorous young man. I have ever from a child to the age wherein I now am, been of this opinion, and am still constant to it. But amongst other things, the strict government of most of our colleges has evermore displeased me. Peradventure, they might have erred less perniciously on the indulgent side. 'Tis a real house of correction of imprisoned youth. They are made debauched by being punished before they are so. Do but come in when they are about their lesson, and you will hear nothing but the outcries of boys under execution, with the thundering noise of their pedagogues drunk with fury. A very pretty way this, to tempt these tender and timorous souls to love their book, with a furious countenance and a rod in hand. A cursed and pernicious way of proceeding. Besides what Quintilian has very well observed, that this imperious authority is often attended by very dangerous consequences, and particularly our way of chastising. How much more decent would it be to see their classes strewed with green leaves and fine flowers, than with the bloody stumps of birch and willows? Were it left to my ordering, I should paint the school with the pictures of joy and gladness, Flora and the Graces, as the philosopher Speusippus did his. Where their profit is, let them have their pleasure too. Such viands as are proper and wholesome for children should be sweetened with sugar, and such as are dangerous to them embittered with gall. 'Tis marvellous to see how solicitous Plato is in his laws concerning the gaiety and diversion of the youth of his city, and how much and often he enlarges upon the races, sports, songs, leaps, and dances, of which, he says, that antiquity has given the ordering and patronage particularly to the gods themselves, to Apollo, Minerva, and the Muses. He insists long upon, and is very particular in, giving innumerable precepts for exercises, but as to the lettered sciences says very little, and only seems particularly to recommend poetry upon the account of music. All singularity in our manners and conditions is to be avoided, as inconsistent with civil society. Who would not be astonished at so strange a constitution as that of Demophoon, steward to Alexander the Great, who sweated in the shade and shivered in the sun? I have seen those who have run from the smell of a mellow apple with greater precipitation than from a harquebus shot, others afraid of a mouse, others vomit at the sight of cream, others ready to swoon at the making of a feather bed. Germanicus could neither endure the sight nor the crowing of a cock. I will not deny but that there may, peradventure, be some occult cause and natural aversion in these cases, but in my opinion a man might conquer it if he took it in time. Precept has in this wrought so effectually upon me, though not without some pains on my part, I confess, that beer excepted, my appetite accommodates itself indifferently to all sorts of diet. Young bodies are supple. One should, therefore, in that age, bend and ply them to all fashions and customs; and provided a man can contain the appetite and the will within their due limits, let a young man, in God's name, be rendered fit for all nations and all companies, even to debauchery and excess, if need be; that is, where he shall do it out of complacency to the customs of the place. Let him be able to do everything, but love to do nothing but what is good. The philosophers themselves do not justify Callisthenes for forfeiting the favour of his master, Alexander the Great, by refusing to pledge him a cup of wine. Let him laugh, play, wench with his prince; nay, I would have him, even to his debauches, too hard for the rest of the company, and to excel his companions in ability and vigour, and that he may not give over doing it, either through defect of power or knowledge how to do it, but for want of will. Multum interest, uturum peccare ali quis nolit, and nesciat. There is a vast difference betwixt forbearing to sin, and not knowing how to sin. Seneca, Epist. 90. I thought I passed a compliment upon a lord, as free from those excesses as any man in France, by asking him before a great deal of very good company, how many times in his life he had been drunk in Germany, in the time of his being there about his Majesty's affairs; which he also took as it was intended, and made answer, 3 times; and withal told us the whole story of his debauches. I know some who, for want of this faculty, have found a great inconvenience in negotiating with that nation. I have often with great admiration reflected upon the wonderful constitution of Alcibiades, who so easily could transform himself to so various fashions without any prejudice to his health; one while outdoing the Persian pomp and luxury, and another the Lacedaemonian austerity and frugality, as reformed in Sparta, as voluptuous in Ionia. Omnis Aristippum dequit color, et status et res. Every complexion of life and station and circumstances became Aristippus. Horace, Epist. 18:23. I would have my pupil to be such an one, quem duplici panno patentia velat, mirabor vitae via si conversa decebit, personamque ferit non inconsinus intramque. I should admire him who with patience bearing a patched garment, bears well a changed fortune, acting both parts equally well. Horace, Epist. 17:25. These are my lessons, and he who puts them in practice shall reap more advantage than he who has had them read to him only, and so only knows them. If you see him, you hear him; if you hear him, you see him. God forbid, says one in Plato, that to philosophize were only to read a great many books, and to learn the arts. Hanc amplissimam omnium artium bene vivendi disciplinam, vita magis quam litteris persecuti sunt. They have proceeded to this discipline of living well, which of all arts is the greatest, by their lives, rather than by their reading. Cicero, Tusculan Disputations, 4:3. Leo, prince of the Phliasians, asking Heraclides Ponticus, It was not Heraclides of Pontus who made the answer, but Pythagoras, of what art or science he made profession. I know, said he, neither art nor science, but I am a philosopher. One approaching Diogenes that, being ignorant, he should pretend to philosophy, I therefore, answered he, pretend to it with so much the more reason. Hegesias entreated that he would read a certain book to him. You are pleasant, said he, you choose those figs that are true and natural, and not those that are painted. Why do you not also choose exercises which are naturally true, rather than those written? The lad will not so much get his lesson by heart as he will practise it. He will repeat it in his actions. We shall discover if there be prudence in his exercises, if there be sincerity and justice in his deportment, if there be grace and judgment in his speaking, if there be constancy in his sickness, if there be modesty in his mirth, temperance in his pleasures, order in his domestic economy, indifference in palate, whether what he eats or drinks be flesh or fish, wine or water. Qui disciplinam suam non ostentationem scientiae, sed legem vitae putet, quique temperit ipse sibi, et decretis pareat. Who considers his own discipline, not as a vain ostentation of science, but as a law and rule of life, and who obeys his own decrees, and the laws he has prescribed for himself. Cicero, Tusculan Disputations, 2:4. The conduct of our lives is the true mirror of our doctrine. Zeuxidamus, to one who asked him, why the Lacedaemonians did not commit their constitutions of chivalry to writing, and deliver them to their young men to read, made answer, that it was because they would inure them to action, and not amuse them with words. With such a one, after 15 or 16 years' study, compare one of our college Latinists, who has thrown away so much time in nothing but learning to speak. The world is nothing but babble, and I hardly ever yet saw that man who did not rather prate too much than speak too little. And yet half of our age is embezzled this way. We are kept 4 or 5 years to learn words only, and to tack them together into clauses, as many more to form them into a long discourse, divided into 4 or 5 parts, and other 5 years at least, to learn succinctly to mix and interweave them after a subtle and intricate manner. Let us leave all this to those who make a profession of it. Going one day to Orleans, I met in that plain on this side Cléry 2 pedants who were travelling towards Bordeaux, about 50 paces distant from one another, and, a good way further behind them, I discovered a troop of horse, with a gentleman at the head of them, who was the late Monsieur le Comte de Rochefoucauld. One of my people inquired of the foremost of these masters of arts who that gentleman was that came after him. He, not having seen the train that followed after, and thinking his companion was meant, pleasantly answered, He is not a gentleman, he is a grammarian, and I am a logician. Now we who, quite contrary, do not here pretend to breed a grammarian or a logician, but a gentleman, let us leave them to abuse their leisure. Our business lies elsewhere. But let our pupil be well furnished with things, words will follow but too fast. He will pull them after him if they do not voluntarily follow. I have observed some to make excuses that they cannot express themselves, and pretend to have their fancies full of a great many very fine things, which yet, for want of eloquence, they cannot utter. 'Tis a mere shift and nothing else. Will you know what I think of it? I think they are nothing but shadows of some imperfect images and conceptions that they know not what to make of within, nor consequently bring out. They do not yet themselves understand what they would be at, and if you but observe how they haggle and stammer upon the point of parturition, you will soon conclude that their labour is not to delivery, but about conception, and that they are all but licking their formless embryo. For my part, I hold, and Socrates commands it, that whoever has in his mind a sprightly and clear imagination, he will express it well enough in one kind of tongue or another, and if he be dumb, by signs. Verbaque praevisam rem non invita sequentur. Once a thing is conceived in the mind, the words to express it soon present themselves, or the words will not reluctantly follow the thing preconceived. Horace, De Arte Poetica, 5, 311. And as another as poetically says in his prose, quum res animum occupavere, verbs ambiunt. When things are once in the mind, the words offer themselves readily; or, when things have taken possession of the mind, the words trip. Seneca, Controversies, 3, Proem. And this other: ipse res verbs rapiunt. The things themselves force the words to express them. Cicero, De Finibus, 3, 5. He knows nothing of ablative, conjunctive, substantive, or grammar, no more than his lackey, or a fishwife of the petit pont. Yet these will give you a bellyful of talk, if you will hear them, and peradventure shall trip as little in their language as the best masters of art in France. He knows no rhetoric, nor how in a preface to bribe the benevolence of the courteous reader. Neither does he care to know it. Indeed, all this fine decoration of painting is easily effaced by the lustre of a simple and blunt truth. These fine flourishes serve only to amuse the vulgar, of themselves incapable of more solid and nutritive diet, as Aper very evidently demonstrates in Tacitus. The ambassadors of Samos, prepared with a long and elegant oration, came to Cleomenes, king of Sparta, to incite him to a war against the tyrant Polycrates, who, after he had heard their harangue with great gravity and patience, gave them this answer: As to the exordium, I remember it not, nor consequently the middle of your speech; and for what concerns your conclusion, I will not do what you desire. Plutarch, Apothegms of the Lacedaemonians. A very pretty answer this, methinks, and a pack of learned orators most sweetly gravelled. And what did the other man say? The Athenians were to choose one of 2 architects for a very great building they had designed. Of these, the first, a pert affected fellow, offered his service in a long premeditated discourse upon the subject of the work at hand, and by his oratory inclined the voices of the people in his favour. But the other in 3 words: O Athenians, what this man says, I will do. Plutarch, Instructions to Statesmen, 104. When Cicero was in the height and heat of an eloquent harangue, many were struck with admiration, but Cato only laughed, saying, We have a pleasant mirth-making consul. Let it go before or come after, a good sentence or a thing well said is always in season. If it neither suit well with what went before, nor has much coherence with what follows after, it is good in itself. I am none of those who think that good rhyme makes a good poem. Let him make short long, and long short, if he will, 'tis no great matter. If there be invention, and that the wit and judgment have well performed their offices, I will say, here's a good poet, but an ill rhymer. Emuncte neris, durus componere versus. Of delicate humour, but of rugged versification. Horace, Satires, 4-8. Let a man, says Horace, divest his work of all method and measure. Tempora certa modosque, et, quod prius ordine verbum est, posterius facias, preponens ultima primis, inventias etiam disjecti membra poetae. Take away certain rhythms and measures, and make the word which was first in order come later, putting that which should be last first, you will find the scattered remains of the poet. Horace, Satires, 1-4 and 58. He will never the more lose himself for that. The very pieces will be fine by themselves. Menander's answer had this meaning, who being reproved by a friend, the time drawing on at which he had promised a comedy, that he had not yet fallen in hand with it, It is made and ready, said he, all but the verses. Plutarch, Whether the Athenians more excelled in arms or in letters. Having contrived the subject, and disposed the scenes in his fancy, he took little care for the rest. Since Ronsard and Du Bellay have given reputation to our French poesy, every little dabbler, for aught I see, swells his words as high, and makes his cadences very near as harmonious as they. Plus sonat quam valet. More sound than sense. Seneca, Epistles, 40. For the vulgar, there were never so many poetasters as now; but though they find it no hard matter to imitate their rhyme, they yet fall infinitely short of imitating the rich descriptions of the one, and the delicate invention of the other of these masters. But what will become of our young gentleman, if he be attacked with the sophistic subtlety of some syllogism? A Westphalia ham makes a man drink, drink quenches thirst, ergo a Westphalia ham quenches thirst. Why, let him laugh at it, it will be more discretion to do so than to go about to answer it, or let him borrow this pleasant evasion from Aristippus. Why should I trouble myself to untie that, which bound as it is, gives me so much trouble? Diogenes Laertius, 270. One offering at this dialectic juggling against Cleanthes, Chrysippus took him short, saying, Reserve these baubles to play with children, and do not by such fooleries divert the serious thoughts of a man of years. If these ridiculous subtleties, contorta et aculeata sophismata, as Cicero calls them, are designed to possess him with an untruth, they are dangerous. But if they signify no more than only to make him laugh, I do not see why a man need to be fortified against them. There are some so ridiculous as to go a mile out of their way to hook in a fine word. Aut qui non verba rebus optant, sed res extricensus arcessunt, quibus verba conveniant. Who do not fit words to the subject, but seek out for things quite from the purpose to fit their words, Quintilian 8:3. And as another says, Qui alicujus verbi decore placentis, vocentur ad id, quod non propuserant scribere, who by their fondness of some fine-sounding word are tempted to something they had no intention to treat of. Seneca, Epistles, 59. I for my part rather bring in a fine sentence by head and shoulders to fit my purpose, than divert my designs to hunt after a sentence. On the contrary, words are to serve, and to follow a man's purpose, and let Gascon come in play where French will not do. I would have things so excelling, and so wholly possessing the imagination of him that hears, that he should have something else to do than to think of words. The way of speaking that I love is natural and plain, the same in writing as in speaking, and a sinewy and muscular way of expressing a man's self, short and pithy, not so elegant and artificial as prompt and vehement. Haec demum sapiet dictio, quux feriet. That has most weight and wisdom which pierces the ear, or, that utterance indeed will have a taste which shall strike the ear. Epitaph on Lucan in Fabricius, Biblioth. Lat. 2:10. Rather hard than wearisome, free from affectation, irregular, incontinuous, and bold, where every piece makes up an entire body, not like a pedant, a preacher, or a pleader, but rather a soldier-like style, as Suetonius calls that of Julius Caesar, and yet I see no reason why he should call it so. I have ever been ready to imitate the negligent garb, which is yet observable amongst the young men of our time, to wear my cloak on one shoulder, my cap on one side, a stocking in disorder, which seems to express a kind of haughty disdain of these exotic ornaments, and a contempt of the artificial. But I find this negligence of much better use in the form of speaking. All affectation, particularly in the French gaiety and freedom, is ungraceful in a courtier, and in a monarchy every gentleman ought to be fashioned according to the court model; for which reason an easy and natural negligence does well. I no more like a web where the knots and seams are to be seen, than a fine figure so delicate that a man may tell all the bones and veins. Quae veritati operam dat oratio, incomposita sit et simplex. Let the language that is dedicated to truth be plain and unaffected. Seneca, Epistles, 40. Quis accurat loquitur, nisi qui vult pulti loqui. For who studies to speak accurately, that does not at the same time wish to perplex his auditory? Idumeus, Epistles, 75. That eloquence prejudices the subject it would advance that wholly attracts us to itself. And as in our outward habit 'tis a ridiculous effeminacy to distinguish ourselves by a particular and unusual garb or fashion, so in language, to study new phrases, and to affect words that are not of current use, proceeds from a puerile and scholastic ambition. May I be bound to speak no other language than what is spoken in the market places of Paris. Aristophanes the grammarian was quite out when he reprehended Epicurus for his plain way of delivering himself, and the design of his oratory, which was only perspicuity of speech. The imitation of words, by its own facility, immediately disperses itself through a whole people. But the imitation of inventing and fitly applying these words is of a slower progress. The generality of readers, for having found a like robe, very mistakenly imagine that they have the same body and inside too, whereas force and sinews are never to be borrowed. The gloss and outward adornment, that is, words and elocution, may. Most of those I converse with speak the same language I here write, but whether they think the same thoughts I cannot say. The Athenians, says Plato, study fullness and elegancy of speaking, the Lacedaemonians affect brevity, and those of Crete to aim more at the fecundity of conception than the fertility of speech, and these are the best. Zeno used to say that he had two sorts of disciples, one that he called Sci Blancus, curious to learn things, and these were his favourites, the other Oi Blancus, that cared for nothing but words. Not that fine speaking is not a very good and commendable quality, but not so excellent and so necessary as some would make it, and I am scandalized that our whole life should be spent in nothing else. I would first understand my own language, and that of my neighbours, with whom most of my business and conversation lies. No doubt but Greek and Latin are very great ornaments, and of very great use, but we buy them too dear. I will here discover one way, which has been experimented in my own person, by which they are to be had better cheap, and such may make use of it as will. My late father having made the most precise inquiry that any man could possibly make amongst men of the greatest learning and judgment, of an exact method of education, was by them cautioned of this inconvenience then in use, and made to believe that the tedious time we applied to the learning of the tongues of them who had them for nothing was the sole cause we could not arrive to the grandeur of soul and perfection of knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans. I do not, however, believe that to be the only cause. So it is, that the expedient my father found out for this was, that in my infancy, and before I began to speak, he committed me to the care of a German, who since died a famous physician in France, totally ignorant of our language, and very fluent and a great critic in Latin. This man, whom he had fetched out of his own country, and whom he entertained with a great salary for this only one end, had me continually with him. He had with him also joined 2 others, of inferior learning, to attend me and to relieve him. These spoke to me in no other language but Latin. As to the rest of his household, it was an inviolable rule that neither himself, nor my mother, nor valet, nor chambermaid, should speak anything in my company but such Latin words as each one had learned to gabble with me. Note: these passages are the basis of a small volume by the Abbé Mangin, Education de Montaigne, ou L'Art des Seigneurs de Latin, à l'instar des Murray Latine. It is not to be imagined how great an advantage this proved to the whole family. My father and my mother by this means learned Latin enough to understand it perfectly well, and to speak it to such a degree as was sufficient for any necessary use, as also those of the servants did, who were most frequently with me. In short, we Latined it at such a rate that it overflowed to all the neighbouring villages, where there yet remain, that have established themselves by custom, several Latin appellations of artisans and their tools. As for what concerns myself, I was above 6 years of age before I understood either French or Perigordin, any more than Arabic, and without art, book, grammar, or precept, whipping, or the expense of a tear, I had by that time learnt to speak as pure Latin as my master himself, for I had no means of mixing it up with any other. If, for example, they were to give me a theme after the college fashion, they gave it to others in French, but to me they were to give it in bad Latin, to turn into that which is good. And Nicholas Grouchy, who wrote a book De Comitiis Romanarum, Guillaume Guerente, who wrote a comment upon Aristotle, George Buchanan, that great Scottish poet, and Marc-Antoine Murray, whom both France and Italy have acknowledged for the best orator of his time, My domestic tutors have often told me that I had in my infancy that language so very fluent and ready, that they were afraid to enter into discourse with me; and particularly Buchanan, whom I since saw attending the late Maréchal de Brissac, then told me, that he was about to write a treatise of education, the example of which he intended to take from mine; for he was then tutor to that Comte de Brissac who afterward proved so valiant and so brave a gentleman. As to Greek, of which I have but a mere smattering, my father also designed to have it taught me by a device, but a new one, and by way of sport; tossing our declensions to and fro after the manner of those who, by certain games of tables, learn geometry and arithmetic; for he, amongst other rules, had been advised to make me relish science and duty by an unforced will, and of my own voluntary motion, and to educate my soul in all liberty and delight, without any severity or constraint; which he was an observer of to such a degree even of superstition, if I may say so, that some being of opinion that it troubles and disturbs the brains of children suddenly to wake them in the morning, and to snatch them violently and over hastily from sleep, wherein they are much more profoundly involved than we, he caused me to be awakened by the sound of some musical instrument, and was never unprovided of a musician for that purpose. By this example you may judge of the rest, this alone being sufficient to recommend both the prudence and the affection of so good a father, who is not to be blamed if he did not reap fruits answerable to so exquisite a culture. Of this, two things were the cause: first, a sterile and improper soil, for, though I was of a strong and healthful constitution, and of a disposition tolerably sweet and tractable, yet I was, withal, so heavy, idle, and indisposed, that they could not rouse me from my sloth, not even to get me out to play. What I saw clearly enough, and under this heavy complexion nourished a bold imagination and opinions above my age. I had a slow wit that would go no faster than it was led, a tardy understanding, a languishing invention, and above all, incredible defect of memory; so that, it is no wonder, if from all these nothing considerable could be extracted. Secondly, like those who, impatient of a long and steady cure, submit to all sorts of prescriptions and recipes, the good man being extremely timorous of any way failing in a thing he had so wholly set his heart upon, suffered himself at last to be overruled by the common opinions, which always follow their leader as a flight of cranes, and complying with the method of the time, having no more those persons he had brought out of Italy, and who had given him the first model of education, about him, he set me at 6 years of age to the College of Guienne, at that time the best and most flourishing in France; and there it was not possible to add anything to the care he had to provide me the most able tutors, with all other circumstances of education, reserving also several particular rules contrary to the college practice; but so it was, that with all these precautions, it was a college still. My Latin immediately grew corrupt, of which also my discontinuance I have since lost all manner of use, so that this new way of education served me to no other end than only at my first coming to prefer me to the first forms; for at 13 years old, that I came out of the college, I had run through my whole course, as they call it, and in truth without any manner of advantage that I can honestly brag of in all this time. The first taste which I had for books came to me with the pleasure in reading the fables of Ovid's Metamorphoses; for, being about 7 or 8 years old, I gave up all other diversions to read them, both by reason that this was my own natural language, the easiest book that I was acquainted with, and for the subject, the most accommodated to the capacity of my age; for as for the Lancelot of the Lake, the Amadis of Gaul, the Juan of Bordeaux, and such farragos, by which children are most delighted with, I had never so much as heard their names, no more than I yet know what they contain, so exact was the discipline wherein I was brought up. But this was enough to make me neglect the other lessons which were prescribed me, and here it was infinitely to my advantage to have to do with an understanding tutor, who very well knew discreetly to connive at this and other truantaries of the same nature; for by this means I ran through Virgil's Aeneid, and then Terence, and then Plautus, and then some Italian comedies, allured by the sweetness of the subject; whereas had he been so foolish as to have taken me off this diversion, I do really believe I had brought away nothing from the college but a hatred of books, as almost all our young gentlemen do. But he carried himself very discreetly in that business, seeming to take no notice, and allowing me only such time as I could steal from my other regular studies, which whetted my appetite to devour those books. For the chief things my father expected from their endeavours to whom he had delivered me for education, were affability and good humour; and, to say the truth, my manners had no other vice but sloth and want of mettle. The fear was not that I should do ill, but that I should do nothing. Nobody prognosticated that I should be wicked, but only useless. They foresaw idleness, but no malice. And I find it falls out accordingly. The complaints I hear of myself are these: he is idle, cold in the offices of friendship and relation, and in those of the public too particular, too disdainful. But the most injurious do not say, why has he taken such a thing? Why has he not paid such an one? But, why does he part with nothing? Why does he not give? And I should take it for a favour that men would expect from me no greater effects of supererogation than these. But they are unjust to exact from me what I do not owe, far more rigorously than they require from others that which they do owe. In condemning me to it, they efface the gratification of the action, and deprive me of the gratitude that would be my due for it, whereas the active well-doing ought to be of so much the greater value from my hands, by how much I have never been passive that way at all. I can the more freely dispose of my fortune the more it is mine, and of myself the more I am my own. Nevertheless, if I were good at setting out my own actions, I could, peradventure, very well repel these reproaches, and could give some to understand that they are not so much offended that I do not enough, as that I am able to do a great deal more than I do. Yet for all this heavy disposition of mine, my mind, when retired into itself, was not altogether without strong movements, solid and clear judgments about those objects it could comprehend, and could also, without any helps, digest them. But amongst other things, I do really believe, it had been totally impossible to have made it to submit by violence and force. Shall I here acquaint you with one faculty of my youth? I had great assurance of countenance and flexibility of voice and gesture in applying myself to any part I undertook to act. For before alter ab 11 tum me vix cooperat annus, I had just entered my 12th year, Virgil 39, I played the chief parts in the Latin tragedies of Buchanan, Guerente, and Murray, that were presented in our College of Guienne with great dignity. Now Andreas Goveanus, our principal, as in all other parts of his charge, was, without comparison, the best of that employment in France, and I was looked upon as one of the best actors. 'Tis an exercise that I do not disapprove in young people of condition, and I have since seen our princes, after the example of some of the ancients, in person handsomely and commendably perform these exercises. It was even allowed to persons of quality to make a profession of it in Greece. Aristoni tragico actori rem apparet, huic et genus et fortuna honesta erant, nec ars, quia nihil tale apud graceos pudori est, ea deformabat. He imparted this matter to Aristo the tragedian, a man of good family and fortune, which neither of them receive any blemish by that profession, nothing of this kind being reputed a disparagement in Greece. Livy 24:24. Nay, I have always taxed those with impertinence who condemn these entertainments, and with injustice those who refuse to admit such comedians as are worth seeing into our good towns, and grudge the people that public diversion. Well-governed corporations take care to assemble their citizens, not only to the solemn duties of devotion, but also to sports and spectacles. They find society and friendship augmented by it, and besides, can there possibly be allowed a more orderly and regular diversion than what is performed in the sight of every one, and very often in the presence of the supreme magistrate himself? And I, for my part, should think it reasonable that the prince should sometimes gratify his people at his own expense, out of paternal goodness and affection, and that in populous cities there should be theatres erected for such entertainments, if but to divert them from worse and private actions. To return to my subject, there is nothing like alluring the appetite and affections; otherwise you make nothing but so many asses laden with books. By dint of the lash you give them their pocketful of learning to keep; whereas, to do well you should not only lodge it with them, but make them espouse it. Section 27.